I was driving down Route 17 just outside of Pine Bluff, a sleepy little town that hadn't changed much since the 50s, at least in spirit. The late afternoon sun dipped low over the horizon, casting long shadows across the blacktop. My windows were down, and the warm breeze carried the faint scent of freshly cut grass. I tapped my fingers on the steering wheel, keeping time with an old blues tune humming from the radio. Everything seemed calm until I saw the red and blue lights flash in my rearview mirror. The wail of the siren sliced through the air. I sighed, glancing at the speedometer. Nope, wasn't speeding. No broken taillight either. So what was this about? I signaled, eased the car to the shoulder, and killed the engine. A cloud of dust swirled in the wake of my tires. Sitting there, I took a deep breath, my pulse steady. The cruiser door opened and out stepped a white cop. Mid-40s, clean-shaven, with a crew cut that looked sharp enough to slice paper. His mirrored shades reflected the world back at me in harsh, distorted angles. He adjusted his belt, the holster at his side sitting heavy like a threat. I'd seen his type before, chest puffed out, authority clinging to him like sweat. He thought he owned the road and everyone on it. As he approached, I could feel the weight of his judgment settling over me, thick and stifling. "Afternoon," he said, voice clipped. "License and registration." I handed them over without a word, my expression unreadable. Silence was often the best way to handle situations like this. Speak too soon and you give them ammunition. Stay quiet and they have to work harder to get a rise out of you. He flipped open my license, his eyes narrowing as he read my name. "James Carter, huh? You from around here?" "Nope," I said simply. His lips pressed into a thin line. "Mind telling me what you're doing out here?" "Just passing through," I said, keeping my tone even. The air between us grew tense, heavy with something unsaid. He leaned in a little closer, peering into the car as if he expected to find a trunk full of contraband. I stayed still, my hands resting calmly on the steering wheel. "You seem pretty comfortable," he remarked, suspicion lacing his words. "Shouldn't I be?" I asked, meeting his gaze head-on. That seemed to throw him off for a second, but he recovered quickly. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered, his hand hovering near his holster. I took my time, unbuckling my seatbelt and pushing the door open. My movements were measured, deliberate. I wasn't about to give this guy any reason to pull that weapon. As I stood, the late afternoon sun caught the gleam of my badge tucked discreetly inside my jacket. The badge he hadn't seen yet. But he would. And when he did, this little encounter was going to take a turn he'd never forget. The soles of my shoes crunched against the gravel as I stepped fully onto the shoulder. The cop, whose badge read Officer Daniel Hayes, sized me up like a hunter tracking prey. His lips curled into a faint smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Hands on the hood," he ordered, voice taut with authority. I stared at him for a beat longer than necessary, making sure he understood I wasn't some nervous kid who'd jump at his bark. But I played along for now. Slowly, I placed my palms on the hood of my car, the metal warm from the sun. "You carrying any weapons?" he asked, his voice dripping with suspicion. "Not the kind you're thinking of," I said under my breath. He stepped closer, the toe of his boot brushing against my heel. "What was that?" "Just making conversation, officer," I replied evenly. Hayes patted me down with the enthusiasm of a man hoping to find something, anything, to justify his assumptions. But I was clean and he knew it. Frustration flickered across his face as he straightened up. "Turn around," he said. I did, locking eyes with him. His jaw clenched, the muscle in his cheek ticking like a time bomb. "You got some nerve," he muttered. "Is that right?" I asked, my voice calm but cutting. His hand hovered near his belt again, fingers brushing the grip of his gun. The tension between us crackled in the air. I could see the wheels turning in his head. He wanted to make this personal, to put me in my place. But he had no idea who he was dealing with. "You know," I said casually, "I get why you're on edge. Must be tough pulling over strangers all day, never knowing who you're dealing with." His eyes narrowed. "What's that supposed to mean?" I shrugged. "Just making conversation again." The radio on his shoulder crackled to life, static breaking the silence. A dispatcher's voice cut through. "Unit 12, status check?" Hayes pressed the button on his shoulder mic, his gaze never leaving mine. "Unit 12, all clear," he lied smoothly. He was about to say something else when I pulled back my jacket just enough for him to see the glint of my badge. FBI. The letters gleamed under the fading sunlight like a brand of authority far above his pay grade. His face went pale, the blood draining from his cheeks. "What the—" "Yeah," I said, my tone razor sharp. "Now we're making conversation." Hayes took a step back, the bravado peeling away like cheap paint. I could see the wheels spinning again, this time in panic. You should probably rethink your approach to traffic stops, I said, my voice low but firm. Could save you a lot of trouble down the road. He swallowed hard, his hand dropping away from his belt. But this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Hayes had crossed a line, and I wasn't the kind of man to let that slide. Not when justice was my business. Officer Hayes looked like a man teetering on the edge of fight or flight. His face was still ghost white, and beads of sweat had formed along his hairline. The shift in power was palpable, and I intended to press my advantage. You want to explain why you pulled me over? I asked, my tone sharp but steady. His lips parted, but no words came out at first. Routine stop, he finally muttered, though even he didn't sound convinced. Routine, huh? I said, stepping closer. You always order folks out of their cars for no reason? Or just the ones who look like me? Hayes stiffened, his jaw tightening. He wanted to deny it, but the truth was already hanging heavy between us. Look, he said, his voice strained, I didn't know who you were. Would it have made a difference? I shot back. Silence. That told me everything I needed to know. I pulled my phone from my pocket, thumbing through contacts until I found the one I wanted. Hayes watched me warily, shifting his weight from foot to foot. You making a call? He asked nervously. Yep, I said, holding the phone to my ear. The line rang twice before a familiar voice answered. Agent Carter, this better be good. I'm elbows deep in paperwork. Got a situation on Route 17, I said, my eyes never leaving Hayes. Pull up Officer Daniel Hayes from Pine Bluff PD. I'll wait. Hayes's face twisted into a grimace. You can't. Oh, I can, I said coolly. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Give me a sec, the voice said. The faint clatter of a keyboard filled the air. Here we go, my contact said after a beat. Hayes. Got a couple of complaints on his record. Nothing serious enough to nail him yet. Looks like he's been skating by on thin ice for a while. Time to break that ice, I said. Hayes's bravado crumbled completely. Listen man, maybe we got off on the wrong foot, he stammered. I hung up the call. You think? The sound of approaching tires drew our attention. A black SUV with tinted windows rumbled toward us, kicking up dust as it pulled to a stop. The door opened, and out stepped a tall, broad-shouldered man in a dark suit. Special Agent Miller, he said, flashing his badge. Got your call, Carter? Thanks for coming, I said. We've got ourselves a little problem here. Miller's sharp eyes zeroed in on Hayes, who looked like he wanted to melt into the asphalt. You're gonna want to come with us, officer, Miller said, his voice cold as steel. Hayes opened his mouth to protest, but I cut him off. Or you can stay here and explain to your department why the FBI's taking a special interest in your traffic stops. Hayes's shoulders slumped in defeat. He knew he was out of options. Miller gestured toward the SUV. Let's go. As they headed for the vehicle, I stood there watching the dust settle. Justice wasn't always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it was quiet, like the sound of gravel under boots as a crooked cop walked toward accountability. And I had a feeling Officer Hayes was about to learn that lesson the hard way. The SUV's engine growled as Miller pulled onto the main road, leaving the cruiser abandoned on the shoulder. I rode in the back with Hayes, who sat rigid, his jaw clenched so tight it looked like it might shatter. Silence filled the cabin, thick and oppressive. Miller glanced at me through the rearview mirror, one eyebrow raised. Want me to handle this or you got it? He asked. I got it, I said, leaning back in my seat. Officer Hayes and I were just getting to know each other. Hayes shot me a glare, his bravado creeping back in now that we were out of public view. You're making a mistake, he said, his voice shaking with a mix of anger and fear. This is harassment. Harassment? I chuckled. That's rich coming from you? You don't know anything about me, he snapped. I leaned forward, my voice low and deliberate. I know you've got a file thick enough to prop up a wobbly table. Excessive force complaints, racial profiling accusations, a nasty habit of making evidence conveniently disappear. Sound familiar? Hayes's face flushed red. None of that was proven. Not yet, I said with a smirk. Miller pulled into a secure lot behind a nondescript building on the outskirts of Pine Bluff. The place was designed to look boring on the outside, but inside, it was a fortress of federal authority. We escorted Hayes through a side entrance, past security checkpoints and surveillance cameras that tracked our every move. The air smelled faintly of coffee and industrial cleaner. Miller led us to an interrogation room, a cold, sterile box with a metal table and 2 chairs bolted to the floor. A one-way mirror stretched across one wall. Have a seat, officer, I said, gesturing to the chair. Hayes hesitated but eventually sank into the chair, his fists clenched on the table. Miller folded his arms and leaned against the wall, letting me take the lead. You like being a cop, Hayes? I asked, pacing slowly around the room. He didn't answer, his jaw set in defiance. I bet you do, I continued. The power, the authority, the way people jump when you say boo. Feels good, doesn't it? You got no right to judge me, he spat. Maybe not, I said, stopping directly in front of him. But I do have the right to ask questions. Like why you felt the need to pull me over for no reason and order me out of my car. Ace sneered. You people always think you're above the law. There it was, the mask slipping, revealing the ugly truth underneath. I leaned in close, my voice razor sharp. Funny thing about the law, Hayes. It cuts both ways. He shifted uncomfortably, the realization sinking in that his usual tactics wouldn't work here. Miller finally spoke up, his voice cool and authoritative. Here's how this is gonna go, Hayes. You cooperate, maybe we go easy on you. Keep stonewalling, and I promise your life's about to get a whole lot harder. Hayes's bravado crumbled further. What do you want from me? He asked, desperation creeping into his tone. The truth, I said simply. Why the traffic stop? And don't even think about lying. We've got enough evidence to bury you. This is your one shot at saving yourself. The room fell into a heavy silence, the weight of his choices pressing down on him. Hayes looked from me to Miller and back again, sweat beading on his forehead. His voice was hoarse when he finally spoke. You don't understand, he said quietly. There's more going on here than you think. Miller and I exchanged a glance. Now we were getting somewhere. The room went deadly quiet, Hayes's words hanging in the air like smoke after a gunshot. His tough guy facade was cracking, fear clawing at the edges of his voice. More going on? I echoed, leaning forward. What does that mean, Hayes? Speak plain. He licked his lips, eyes darting to the one-way mirror as though the walls themselves were listening. You really think Pine Bluff's just some sleepy little town? He said, voice low. There's a whole system in place. Judges, deputies, business owners, people who've got each other's backs. You step out of line, they make you disappear. I narrowed my eyes. And you're part of that system? His gaze dropped to the table. I didn't have much of a choice. You either play along or you get run out of town. Or worse. Miller straightened from his spot against the wall, the intensity in his eyes dialed up a notch. Names, he said firmly. We want names, Hayes. Who's running this show? Hayes hesitated, his shoulders slumping in defeat. Sheriff Norton's at the top, he admitted grudgingly. But he's just one piece. There's Judge Pruitt, a couple of business owners in on it too, keeping the money flowing and the trouble buried. Miller's jaw tightened. Human trafficking? Drugs. Hayes nodded grimly. Both. You think I like shaking down folks for petty nonsense? Nah, that's just cover. Keeps people too scared to poke their noses where they don't belong. I let out a slow breath, piecing together the puzzle. Pine Bluff wasn't just a backwater town, it was a front for something much darker. You know what this means for you, right? I said to Hayes. You're going to testify. Lay it all out in court. Every name, every detail. And if you try to play games, I'll personally make sure you spend the rest of your life in a cage. Hayes's face twisted with resentment, but he nodded. I get it. Better the feds than Norton. Miller pulled out his phone and started making calls, setting the wheels of justice in motion. Within minutes, the building was buzzing with activity. Agents were being briefed, warrants drafted. As Hayes was escorted out under heavy guard, I leaned against the table, my heart still steady despite the weight of what we'd uncovered. You think he's telling the truth? Miller asked, hanging up his phone. Enough of it, I said. Guys like him always leave out the part that makes them look the worst, but we'll get the full story. Miller nodded. We're gonna blow Pine Bluff wide open. Damn right we are. The door opened and another agent stepped in. Warrants are ready, he said. We're moving in on Norton and his crew tonight. Miller slapped my shoulder. You in? I smiled faintly. Wouldn't miss it. Later that night. The raid on Pine Bluff was swift and decisive. Squad after squad of agents swept through the sheriff's office, Judge Pruitt's mansion, and a handful of shady businesses that had been fronts for the operation. Evidence piled up faster than we could catalog it. Ledgers, coded communication logs, even surveillance footage. Sheriff Norton was dragged out in cuffs, his face red with fury. You sons of bitches, he roared. You don't know what you're messing with. I stood there watching as justice finally came knocking on Pine Bluff's door. Norton locked eyes with me and for a moment I saw the same rage Hayes had carried. Entitlement, hatred, desperation. You're done, I said calmly. Your whole operation's done. He spat at the ground, but it didn't matter. The game was over and he knew it. As the agents loaded Norton and his cronies into transport vehicles, Miller came up beside me. "Not bad for a day's work," he said with a grin. "Yeah," I agreed, watching the flashing red and blue lights paint the night. "Not bad at all. Justice wasn't always pretty, but tonight, it had been swift and absolute. And Pine Bluff would never be the same again." The morning after the raid, Pine Bluff was strangely quiet. Not the uneasy, suffocating kind of silence that had weighed down the town for years, but something different, cleaner, lighter, like the air after a hard rain. The streets were mostly empty, save for a few reporters still hanging around outside the courthouse, their cameras slung over their shoulders like restless sentries. I stood off to the side, nursing a cup of terrible coffee from a gas station off Route 17. The bitter taste clung to my tongue, but it kept me grounded, which was exactly what I needed right now. There was a strange kind of peace in this moment, but I knew better than to let it fool me. The raid had been a victory, sure. The sheriff, the judge, and a handful of local business owners who had lined their pockets with blood money were now sitting in federal custody. The evidence was overwhelming: ledgers, coded communications, even video recordings of backroom deals and under-the-table exchanges. The town's ugly secrets had been dragged into the light, kicking and screaming. But I wasn't naive enough to think the fight was over. Miller walked up beside me, his tie loosened and his sleeves rolled up. He looked as tired as I felt, but there was a grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Hell of a takedown," he said, clapping me on the back. "You should be proud." "Pride's not the point," I said, my gaze fixed on the courthouse steps where the last of the suspects were being processed. "Point is we did the job." Miller nodded thoughtfully. "Yeah, but you know as well as I do, jobs like this don't come with clean endings." He wasn't wrong. Pine Bluff wasn't the first town corrupted by greed and hatred, and it sure as hell wouldn't be the last. For every operation we took down, there were 5 more waiting to fill the void. The names and faces changed, but the evil stayed the same, rooted deep, festering beneath the surface of places that looked picture-perfect from the outside. As Miller stepped away to make another round of calls, I found myself drawn to the edge of the courthouse lawn. A group of townsfolk had gathered there, regular people, the kind who kept the world turning despite all its ugliness. An older man in denim overalls and a John Deere cap stood with his hands tucked into his pockets. Beside him, a middle-aged woman clutched a little girl's hand tightly, her expression a mixture of relief and lingering unease. A young man with fire in his eyes stood at the edge of the group, his arms crossed defiantly. I walked over, nodding in greeting. "Agent Carter, right?" the older man asked, his voice gravelly from years of hard work and cigarettes. "That's me." He extended a weathered hand. "Name's Earl. I just wanted to say thank you. We've been waiting for this day a long time." "You're welcome," I said, shaking his hand firmly. "But this is just the beginning. Cleaning up's gonna take time." "We're ready," the young man said, his voice steady with conviction. "Pine Bluff's worth fighting for." I studied their faces, tired but hopeful, scarred but not broken. These were the people who had lived under the thumb of corruption for years, who had seen their neighbors disappear, their voices silenced. And now they were standing here, ready to reclaim what was theirs. "Good," I said. "Because it's your town now. Make it count." As I turned to leave, the little girl tugged on her mother's sleeve. "Mama, is it over?" she whispered. Her mother knelt down, brushing a hand through the child's hair. "It's better now," she said softly. "But there's still work to do." That simple truth hit harder than I expected. The raid had been a victory, yes, but it was just one battle in a war that stretched far beyond Pine Bluff. Evil didn't vanish overnight. It adapted, found new cracks to slip through, new faces to hide behind. I thought of the countless other towns just like this one, where people were still living in fear, where justice was a distant dream. For every Sheriff Norton we put behind bars, there was another one out there, waiting for their turn at corruption's throne. And that was the burden we carried as agents, knowing that the work was never truly done. Miller reappeared at my side, his phone buzzing incessantly. "Looks like we're already getting tips from neighboring counties," he said. "People are starting to talk now that Norton's empire is crumbling." "Good," I said. "Let's keep the pressure on." He grinned. "You're relentless, Carter. Ever think about taking a vacation?" I laughed quietly, though there wasn't much humor in it. "Maybe when the world stops needing guys like us." Miller's smile faded, and he nodded solemnly. We both knew that day wasn't coming anytime soon. As the sun climbed higher, casting warm light over the courthouse and the town beyond, I finished my coffee and tossed the empty cup into a nearby trash can. Pine Bluff had scars, deep, ugly ones, but now it had a chance to heal. And as long as there were people like Earl, the young man with fire in his eyes, and that little girl asking if the nightmare was over, I knew there was hope. But hope wasn't enough on its own. It needed action, resilience, and vigilance. And that was the real fight, to keep pushing, to keep shining a light into the darkness until there was nowhere left for evil to hide. Miller's phone buzzed again, and I knew what that meant. Another case, another town, another battle waiting to be fought. "You ready?" he asked. "Always," I said. And as we walked back toward the SUVs, I felt the weight of responsibility settle back onto my shoulders. It was heavy, sure. But I'd carry it gladly, knowing that every step forward was a step toward something better. Because in the end, justice wasn't a destination, it was a journey. And I was just getting started. If this story resonated with you, share it with those who need to hear it. Let's start conversations that matter and that will lead to change. Subscribe to our channel for more stories like this that challenge us, inspire us, and remind us of what we are capable of when we stand up for what is right.